Welcome, everybody, to GAMEOLOGY episode 33. I'm one of your hosts, Mathew Favai.
And I'm Attila, Gabriel Brunetsky.
On episode 33, we're talking all about rock, paper, scissors as a gameplay mechanic. Attila, you brought this topic up as you do most. Why is this topic important?
So it's one of these odd things where I think a lot of people get really dismissive of games that use the sort of quote-unquote rock, paper, scissors, or some people might know type advantage system in games like Pokemon. People say, oh, it's just rock, paper, scissors, fire beats grass, grass beats water, water beats fire, that's just kid stuff. And yet, type advantages are present in like pretty much any game you play ever. It's just some are a little more subtle than others, and effectively, it doesn't make a difference whether it's obscured or whether it's more visible to the player, like in Pokemon. It's a vital part of game design. I just think that people shouldn't try to ignore it or pretend that it's a bad thing that we shouldn't be using.
Yeah, in a way, when you first brought it up, I was like, all right, let me put my brain on this. And I've been playing Breath of the Wild, and there's some areas where elemental damage of certain types is incredibly powerful and will transform one enemy from being a bit of a nuisance to a one-shot assassin. And the way to combat that is with the proper armor or an elixir or a potion of some kind. And I was thinking, is that really fun? And at times I don't think it is, because that's not a reflex, that's a preparation. Putting on a jacket because it's cold outside is not fun. It's just preparation. And
I think, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, but where rock, paper, scissors becomes really interesting to me is when you have signaling. So that if you're playing Punch-Out or Dark Souls or a game or Street Fighter, a game where your opponent is going to do, say, a large attack, and you have that window of time to do the proper counter. To me, that to me that is what makes rock, paper, scissors so important, and especially in competitive gaming.
Right, and I think that's like you sort of touched on one of the sort of concepts I was going to mention is the idea that like rock, paper, like type advantage or just things that are of unequal footing, like the heavy attack, which is going to deal more damage but leaves you open to a certain amount of vulnerability, and then the quick attack, which can be used to counter that sort of thing. Like it's all sort of based on the fundamental root of this beats this, this beats this, this beats this, working around in at least a triangle. I mean, the very sort of core idea of a game like rock, paper, scissors is meant to be this like super basic thing which doesn't have any skill involved with it. It's just a way of like, for lack of a coin toss, basically. But when you have different inputs and different execution that goes into actually pulling off those different maneuvers, that's when it gets much more interesting.
Whereas rock, paper, scissors is just a random whatever you're going to pull out. But it's a big game that has used a lot of rock, paper, scissors lately is Overwatch. And
exactly.
And what Overwatch has been doing really well is that because you can switch on the fly, and because you can switch up these strategies, you remove the element of a character being considered cheap or a strategy being overpowered. Because if someone uses the same strategy over and over again, and you know the counter, that's the thing with rock, paper, scissors, is the counters have to be known to be, or they need to be reached in creative methods, which is very satisfying for the player. So you punish anyone that uses the same strategy and being predictable by allowing a known counter to be used as a defense.
Yeah, and that's straight up rock, paper, scissors. When you see somebody using like the same thing multiple times in a row, you switch up your strategy.
Like Bart Simpson always in his mind, he says, "Nothing beats rock." Good old rock. And then you've got, that also creates strategies because of the rock, paper, scissors of what character in an Overwatch can beat another one. And the large cast of them, this means that you can be very creative, and you could have a five-member team different from many other five-member teams that, because of the counters and the strengths, that allows gamers to be creative, and it advances the strategy.
Yeah, and I just like talking about strategy. I recently got Fire Emblem Heroes for iOS. I was always sort of interested in the Fire Emblem franchise, but I never had an opportunity to try one of the games, and this was a great opportunity to see like what a little sample of the game's like. I know everyone who's a actual Fire Emblem fan will say that this game's really dumbed down, but it's perfect for a mobile game. And they did the best sort of conversion possible. Is that since I've played this mobile game, I now want a more deep and complex version of it. So I'm going to buy like Fire Emblem Awakening or something like that. Which I heard was one of the a good game to get started in with that series. But the game, the whole Fire Emblem series, even though this game features a more simplified version of the so-called weapons triangle, that swords beat axes, axes beat lances, and lances beat swords. And each of them has a sort of color associated with them, so you get the same like red, green, blue. Since every character you can see on the battlefield has one of those 3 weapon types, you'll know as you move your troops around the field, I want to get my red sword wielder as close to their green axe wielder as possible. And in a way, it's like, yeah, it's sort of obvious, but it promotes a kind of strategic thinking of like, well, it's rather than just every single character just being simple and the same and just having higher or lower attack strats, and that just, it just becomes a numbers game anyway at that point. The feeling of knowing like, oh, my character is better against that character. What can I do to position them on the battlefield in such a way that they're likely to engage with one another?
Yeah, then it becomes a lot more similar to chess in that way, where they have a lot different move sets for each of the opponents, and the ability to do drastically different results with the same character, whereas someone who's a water can do so much more against this type than the other type. That's just like perfect for that kind of strategy game.
Well, in a way, it's almost like a step. I'm not going to necessarily say a step up from chess, but it's in a sort of different sort of vein than chess, because there are no type advantages in chess. Every single piece has its known move set, and one pawn isn't going to be better than another pawn. There aren't red, green, blue pawns that have different advantages or disadvantages from one another. So the game the game would play out essentially just like chess if there were no type advantages. But because there are type advantages, then positioning on the battlefield becomes even more key, and that's why like moving one troop, having one character like nudge somebody over by one grid space so that they end up closer to their established target, and then they can move in for the kill. Like, that's what makes the gameplay more appealing to me than just if I was to play like against AI chess on my phone.
Yeah, that's true. And it's Banner Saga has been doing really well with that, and obviously Fire Emblem's been around for a long time. On the more that's a very traditional and easy way to do it in a strategy game like that. An interesting game I had thought about was the wrestling games for the N64, made by Aki Games. These were my favorite wrestling games at the time, and they have the system where you can punch and you can grapple. And a block blocks a punch, and a dodge dodges a grapple, but they will not work on the other. So it becomes this sort of fake out game, and then trying to catch the signal. And as an added layer, if you time it perfectly, then you will get a reversal. So it's just a very, very simplified version of that. But the playing that like local multiplayer, those are my favorite moments, where it's that kind of like game of chicken and psyching out opponents and the psychology of that. And it just became, if you had incredible timing, you were unstoppable. And I thought that was what's been missing in almost every wrestling game since then.
I can't say I would necessarily know. I haven't played any of those. The only kind of fighting game I've actually played is Smash Brothers. So Smash Brothers isn't actually very much in the way of rock paper scissors gameplay. Just every character has such a like varied and unique moveset that the different character abilities don't have this sort of strict one beats another, because you'd never want one character to have a leg up on another character. Everything I've been talking about with the sort of Fire Emblem game works because you go into Fire Emblem Heroes with a team of 4 units, and you can have, red, green, blue, archer, healer, whatever as the 4th unit. But if you are going into a 1 versus 1 match, you don't want one character to strictly be better than another character.
But in a way, the characters themselves in Smash wouldn't be considered a rock or a paper, but the move set in Smash Brothers that they all share in terms of like an attack or a special attack.
Yeah.
Those work in essence. I mean, a block is going to affect one of these better, and I don't play a lot of Smash, but from what I remember, it is based on that, is it not?
I mean, yeah, that you do have the ability to like block and dodge between different attacks, but certain characters have overall slower movesets and certain characters have overall faster movesets. And I think that it's an interesting question of balance as to whether or not the faster characters, like historically, faster characters have always been considered quote unquote higher tier than slower characters, just because if your opponent is winding up for a punch and you can just get in and jab them and interrupt their attack, and you can just keep doing that at every single interval, then you're going to rack up the damage on them, even if your individual attacks don't do as much. Mm-hmm. So I think Smash is kind of an interesting example of where the sort of type advantage stuff isn't used and it creates a compelling gameplay experience nonetheless. I just wanted to illustrate more the situations where rock, paper, scissors gameplay is used, perhaps even more subtly. Like, people don't think of Halo as a game that has type advantages because you're shooting bullets at each other. Mm-hmm. But in Halo, every character, or I should say every player character, if you're playing multiplayer, has a layer of shielding and then an underlying amount of health. And one thing that they've always had in the Halo games is the human weapons, which shoot bullets, and the alien weapons, which fire energy projectiles. And the energy projectiles have always been especially good at draining shields, and then the bullets are the ones that are effective against the underlying character health. So when you're playing against somebody, your ideal sort of weapon loadout would often be like you have one energy weapon to strip away the character's shields, and then you follow up with something that fires bullets to take the character out.
Okay, all right. And I mean, every character has access to both of these weapons in that sense. Yeah, well,
they're sort of littered around the battlefield. Like the reason it's sort of even is because, at least in Halo 3 and then the newest Halo 5, every character starts with the same weapon loadout.
Okay.
So you all start with just bullet firing weapons, the sort of assault rifle and the pistol, and then you can like find weapons around the battlefield. In fact, one of those sort of dominant combinations became something called the plasma pistol, which could be charged up and fire a shot that would completely deplete someone's shields. And then you would have a precision weapon. Specifically in Halo 3, it was the battle rifle, which fired a very specific shot. And so you would have the plasma pistol out, you'd knock off a character's shields, switch weapons to the battle rifle, and follow up with one shot to the head, and you'd kill the other person.
You know what? I had not played that game, but I remember hearing about that. Just
the noob combo.
Yeah, that's right. Now, what you were mentioning about these weapon types and them having sort of the built-in rock, paper, scissors there, I think if you look back at, say, a game like Quake, which has a beautiful setup of weapons that some are more powerful but are slower moving, a railgun that's super powerful at distance and is pretty weak up close if you don't know what you're doing with it. And I feel like that is obviously really important. It's a very effective way of making a fun, competitive, and balanced multiplayer shooter. The problem I find with a lot of games, modern games, is that game designers have been so enamored with the idea of progression because they know that hooks people. They saw the success of Modern Warfare, and we've never gotten away from it for the most part. And it just feels like when I jump into a multiplayer shooter like Battlefront, and I mean, that game has plenty of flaws, and one of the main flaws is that your starting gun is terrible. It's terrible. And there are some games where you jump in, and if you haven't been already playing for a couple of weeks, you're screwed. You don't have the jetpack that gets you around. And if you come up to somebody, and the rock, paper, scissors is that playing the game longer beats playing the game day one, reflexes aside,
that's not even rock, paper, scissors anymore.
Yeah, that's just unfair. That's just exploitation, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that now when Halo 5 was coming out, it was actually advertising the fact that everyone has the same starting loadout. Like now that's a selling feature, the fact that, hey guys, multiplayer's balanced because everyone has access to the same weapons.
How innovative.
Yeah, no kidding.
But didn't Halo 5 have this sort of card system where you were...
Yes, there were two main modes in Halo 5. There was the arena, where everything was perfect and even balanced, and then there was Warzone, where everything was insane and unbalanced, where you could just, buy a bunch of cards and then call in power weapons and do whatever you wanted.
Right, and then when you're playing that, I'm assuming you would feel a kind of pressure, like, well, okay, if you're losing, you're probably not going to be willing to spend any of these cards, right? So you kind of, you make a choice as it's going down, and then you think, well, screw it, this game's over. So I think that it would be, in a way, it could just be a real slippery slope downwards, or you might feel the pressure from someone in your team, like, hey man, pitch in, use some cards.
I don't think it was a particularly elegant implementation. Like, I think it was an interesting experiment, but for a lot of the reasons that you're describing, like, and there's people like me who, like, I just hoard rare stuff, and I never get the feeling of, oh, I should really use this. I think it would have probably been much better. Like, the problem is they wanted to tie this in with microtransactions, right? They wanted people to buy card packs and all that sort of thing. I think it would have been much more interesting if you got these cards within a match, because then you don't have this feeling of, oh, I should save this for another match when I'm going to be doing better and I just want to steamroll the opponent. If you're getting card packs inside of a match and then you're able to use those like that, they had a call down system like that in Halo 4, and it's very similar to the kill perk system that was in the Call of Duty franchise. But keeping the rewards inside of a match would like incentivize people to probably play and like use their cards like without hoarding them like I would do.
Yeah, exactly. You want to have
it's kind of a separate discussion.
Sure. Okay. Well, is there anything else you wanted to touch on in terms of RPS?
Yeah. So if you've, I just wanted to like mention one other example of like how you might see type advantage used in like a real-time strategy game. If you would be able to produce, like in the Command and Conquer franchise, you could produce infantry units, aircraft units, and like vehicles and tanks and that sort of stuff. And again, they have this like different weapon types in the series, like infantry that shoot bullets at each other. So bullets are always good against infantry because they can just mow them down. Then you have tanks, which have obviously the anti-armor weapons, which are good against other tanks. But then you have vehicles that have like chain guns, and then you have vehicles that are good against infantry. And similarly, you could have infantry that have rockets, and the rockets are good against armor, and aircraft for that matter. So just by sort of setting these kind of base types and then having weapon types layered on top of them, you can create this kind of shift of armor that's good against armor, or armor that's good against infantry, or armor that's good against aircraft, and then you have infantry which are good against other infantry, or infantry that are good against armor, and like having the sort of two, not exactly triangles, but these different advantages and disadvantages layered on top of each other. I think that's more than anything the kind of type advantage gameplay that people like to see. So, Fire Emblem, I think the core game does a bit more in that sort of vein of having like not just the sort of red, green, blue, but magic wielders are better against like armored characters. Like they have a really high defense but really low resistance to magic and that kind of thing. Far more than Pokemon does in that sort of sense, that Pokemon is like the epitome of just rock, paper, scissors type advantage. But again, you're going into Pokemon with, I think competitive teams are like 3 characters. And, there's such a huge rock, paper, scissors network going on in Pokemon that having 3 different characters to choose from still makes it an interesting choice. So I guess the sort of the moral of the story for this episode is like, don't be dismissive of type advantage or rock, paper, scissors gameplay. Don't think of it as being too kiddie, just acknowledge it for the strategy that it is. And game developers don't shy away from using it.
There's one point I wanted to touch on when you were talking about RTS. Do you not find that with the real-time strategy game, it eventually becomes a little too similar to the in real life game of RTS, because you are like when you're playing Fire Emblem and I can see your pieces and you can see mine, and then it becomes this turn-based standoff where the moves are visible, and in a sense you can have a signaling process. But when you're playing an RTS and there's a fog of war, I guess, that encourages scouting, and that makes that an entire part of the game, because without that, then you're just sort of guessing and you're just throwing them out there. And is it better to have just an overwhelming force of, say, tanks that do one thing? Is it better to have a completely separate, like 25% of every type so you can handle everything? Would 25% be enough to take out 100% of like an equal force? Or, I mean, like I mentioned, scouting becomes so important. Maybe faking out your opponent becomes a good strategy. You can send, one enemy type in to try to scare them and have them build up another one. So I guess I answered my own question with scouting. All right. Well, that's going to do it. Thanks for bringing up this topic, Attila, and sharing your thoughts on that. Game designers out there, let's see some more RPS in your games. My name has been Matthew Fava, and will continue to be. You can find me on Twitter at GameThinkTalk. And Attila?
You can find me on Twitter at BluishGreenPro, and check out my website, bluishgreenproductions.com.
Thanks, everybody. If you enjoyed the episode and you know somebody who might, share it with them. It really helps. Bye for now.
Thanks. Bye-bye.